Good morning and welcome to my office. Well, I'm in my office. You're not in my office. Well, actually, I'm not in my office either. I'm somewhere far away. Good morning and welcome to class, and let's leave it at that. And welcome to our last study in the this series we've been doing on roadmaps for the wind, understanding Christian spirituality. We've looked at several models. This morning we're going to look at one last model, and it is the model that I have most kind of made my own through research and study. This model comes to us first from my professor, Gordon MacDonald. He's the one who wrote the life questions we looked at last week. He wrote this book called Christ Followers in the Real World. He also taught this model to us some in one of our classes. And it looks at the reality that people are spiritual in different ways. There tends to be kind of different spiritual personalities. Although this isn't exactly a personality issue, because personality hopefully doesn't change all that much, but spiritual modalities can. You also run into this in the work of Richard Foster in his book Streams of Living Water. And in fact, once you start studying spirituality for very long, you'll note that people have a tendency to kind of try to categorize different kinds of spirituality in different ways. This is just one of the many ways that people have done that. Here are the spiritual models that we'll be looking at this morning. You see them up there on the screen, the activist model, the contemplative model, the doctrinal model, the relational model, the model that I have here called the sacred sacramental model, and the experiential model. We'll look at each of these in some detail and work our way through them. But I want to begin by, while this is still in front of you, by talking about the reality that God is capable of infinite specificity, that we are very different from one another. That no two of us in this room are exactly alike, and no two humans on this planet are exactly alike. I don't know whether it's true that no two snowflakes are ever exactly the same, but I suspect that it is, because it's very clear that God is able to create uniqueness. Obviously, God has created more than 6 different people, and so there's more than these 6 different models. But these 6 can be combined in different ways, and one of the things that I've seen over my time of working with this model is that, that people affirm it like crazy. When they examine themselves, they say, yeah, I'm kind of a combination of this and this. What tends to be true is that people will affirm 1 or 2 of these. They'll say, yeah, it's really good to approach your spirituality doctrinally, and maybe through the activist model. So they'll choose 2 that are affirmed, and then there'll be 2 or 3 that people are kind of ambivalent about. If you want to do that thing, that's fine, but it's not really my thing. I can see that it could work, and I'll engage in it some, but it's not really my go-to kind of thing. And then there'll be 1 or 2 of these that people will often look at and say, no, that's dangerous. Don't do that. That shouldn't be done. Truth is, though, and as we'll look at this before we're finished with this morning's class, I can show you Jesus doing all of these. That there is, in fact, none of these that we shouldn't do. And, in fact, all of these have a distortion or 2 that can be dangerous. There are ways in which none of these should be done. That tends to be true in spirituality. If you stop interacting with God, then even if what you're doing is a good thing in other circumstances, if you're not interacting with God, you ought to cut it out. Whatever it is you're doing. It's better to not pray than it is to pray in a way where you're ignoring God while in the posture of prayer. You're going through the motions of prayer, but you're not praying. The Pharisees did that, and it led them to be murderers. It's better not to pray than to mess with that. But each of these have a healthy expression, a way of doing things that is healthy. One of them is a little weirder than the others. We'll probably spend more time on one of these than the others, but just because it's stranger. But each of these has a very healthy expression. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump in and begin with the activist mode. What I'm going to do with each of these is explain to you what I call the heart's cry. And the reason I call it the heart's cry is that the reason that people find this way of engaging with God, this spiritual impulse or this mode of spirituality to be effective in their lives is because their hearts long for it. A person wants to be with God in just this way. I label that impulse of a compelling drive to actually do this kind of thing. I label that the heart's cry. The heart is crying out for God in this particular way. People can look at a thing that people might do and say, yeah, that's a good thing to do, but their heart isn't necessarily moved by it. But a person who is dominant in a particular impulse or modality, they're going to want that and feel unfulfilled without it. So, the first one we'll look at is the activist impulse or the activist modality. The heart's cry of the activist is, what can I do to join with God in what He is doing or wants to do in our world today? An activist finds God by doing something good. This person says, I seek out trouble and problems and injustice because I know that if I go to a place where things are out of whack, I will find God. I have several friends who are very moved by the refugee crisis that's taking place in Syria. And if you read their comments on Facebook, they are just absolutely flummoxed that anyone would not realize that God is with the refugee. And of course, that's a very complex geopolitical situation, and I don't mean to call you dumb if you don't realize that. But these folks do. They look at the poor and the broken and they say, that's where God is. Jesus once said that whatever you do for the least of these, and it's in a judgment scene where people have either done it or they haven't, and they're both shocked to find out that, well, when did I ever not take care of you? When did I see you in those dreadful circumstances and I didn't help you? Or when did I help you? I helped other people, but I didn't help you. And Jesus to both groups says, whatever you do for the least of these, you do for me. And the activist says, I'm going to encounter the Lord when I do this. So I may be it looks like I'm putting a coat on a kid who doesn't have one. But the truth is what I'm doing is I'm clothing Jesus. I may be working at a soup kitchen and there's a long line of people and every single one of them is Jesus. I'm going to take care of people because when I do, that's where I meet God. And I meet God in the conversations that I have with the poor. I meet God when I see people whose lives are totally out of whack. And I step in as an agent of peace. I guide them to better things. That's the activist impulse. They pray with their hands and their feet. They pray by doing. You know, they would say, don't just sit there. Do something. They intentionally go to the dark places in this world. The activist impulse draws people to places of conflict, danger, poverty, where the world is broken down. Because they know that's where I'll find God. God's purpose is to overcome trouble. So I go to the troubled place so that I can work with God in that place. I can be God's agent there, and as I'm good to people in those places, I'm good to God. I'm His good and faithful servant. So, and if you've ever done any sort of radical benevolence work, maybe you've gone into a disaster area and you've helped people who are in disaster, and you've had that feeling of being spiritually awakened because the work you were doing was tearing out sheetrock, but it just felt like more than that. That's the activist spirituality. The next one we'll look at is about as far from that as you can get, and that's contemplative spirituality. Whereas the activist would say, don't just sit there, do something. The contemplative would say, don't just do something, sit there. The heart's cry of the contemplative is, I long to be still in the peaceful presence of God and to hear His mysterious voice. The contemplative will say, I find God when I get still. I am surrounded by noise and visual distraction everywhere. There are advertising when I drive down the road. There's billboards. The sounds are everywhere. People have music all the time. There is video everywhere. Our phones have brought distraction into our lives at a scale that our grandparents could not have imagined. And the contemplative says, stop! Let it all be still. I want to be still because I truly believe that God's presence and His mysterious way of interacting with me, His mysterious voice, is more life-giving and interesting than any other sound. So the contemplative will get still, and either they will get still and meditate on the Scriptures and listen to God speak to them as the words come off the page and into their hearts and minds, or maybe they'll get still without anything at all. They'll spend time in contemplative prayer, being quiet, knowing that prayer is not always monologue done by the human, that sometimes God interacts with us while we pray, that He moves our emotions, that He stirs our thoughts and our thinking, and even speaks His own thoughts, and if you can call that speaking, the way that He can interact with Him. And you say, well, how does He do that? I don't know. I just know enough to know that it happens. Because when we rise from that, we're often very different, far more peace-oriented, and more able to love our enemies. So the contemplative impulse is the impulse of living the life in a rhythm of getting quiet and still, of stopping our frenetic activity and our crazy breakneck pace and saying, I need to be still. The next impulse we'll look at this morning is the doctrinal impulse. And the heart's cry of the doctrinal impulse is, let me search and discover and find you, O God, because as I learn about you, my heart is taught to love you. The doctrinal perspective says that I need to know about God to know Him. It's not simply learning about a subject. It is learning to know His ways. Moses, after the Exodus is over and immediately before receiving the divine name, says to God, but teach me your ways. If I found favor in your sight, then show me your ways. And he's just received the law, so he knows or should know an awful lot about God. And he's just seen the Exodus event, so he knows the great power of God. But what he's saying is, I want to know you. My heart wants to know who you are and what you're like. And I know I'm early in this relationship with you. Let me know you. The Apostle Paul, similarly in the book of Philippians, would say, I want to know Christ and the power of His rising. Now, Paul has actually been caught up into the third heaven. He has seen Christ face to face. He has talked to the resurrected Christ. He's had encounters with the Christ on the road on the way to Damascus. If he's saying, I want to know Christ, if he doesn't know Him, what hope do any of us have? Well, but what does he mean? What he means is, I'm not done learning. I want to dig deeper. I never want to be finished coming to know God, because I understand that as I grow closer to God through my struggle for knowledge and understanding. And it's not just knowledge for knowledge's sake. Paul will say knowledge puffs up. It's wanting to know God the way that you want to get to know your spouse. Actually, this is my 18th anniversary. I've been married 18 years now. And still, Ashley is a wondrous mystery to me that I still want to know. I probably know her better than just about anybody. Her parents may know her in some ways better than I do, but I wouldn't put your money on it. No offense, Bill and Nancy, but I'm not done learning. She grows and changes, and I want to discover more. Because I love her. That's what makes the doctrinal impulse more than just an academic pursuit of information. It is the desire to learn and stretch and grow so that I can love Him. The more I learn about God, the more beautiful I discover Him to be. And the doctrinal impulse is about searching and knowing so that I can love. The doctrinalist knows that God is an excellent teacher, and that He is not going to fail in his teaching of you. So that if you will spend time wanting to be a student, or even more than a student, a friend who wants to know their friend well, God will teach you about Himself. And as you come to know Him, you will discover wondrous things. That's the doctrinalist impulse. The next one we'll look at is the relational impulse. And the relationalist their heart's cry will say, who will love me and allow me to love them in the name of Jesus, so that among us the Spirit of God will move? The relationalist will say, I find God when I'm together with His people. You know, the reality in the New Testament is that the word you is, for the most part, actually the word y'all. In English, we don't have a plural you. Both the singular you for one person, you, right there, you, and also the plural for y'all is one word, you. That puts us at a disadvantage because that's not true in Greek. Greek has word su for an individual and humes for a plurality. Well, when you run into the word you, especially in Paul's letters, just go ahead and assume it's humes, it's y'all. Because for the most part, Christianity was envisioned not as an individualistic religion, not as something that I by myself believe, but something that we believe together. And so this person is going to crave the presence of God among the people. It's not just longing for friendship, and we all have that. And it's not just longing for sociality, the ability to be around persons. We don't all have that. Some people would rather not have that. But some of those folks still are relationalists. Introverts are sometimes, paradoxically, relationally driven, because they know if I go be with the people of God, if I gather in assembly with the church, then God will be in our midst, and I want to be with God. I really crave His presence. And so a relationalist will want to get together. They will say, as I interact with other Christians and I pay attention, and we pay attention to God together, God works in my life. So I want to be with these other folks. All right, so this next impulse is, it's kind of a hodgepodge. It's actually several different impulses brought together. The name I used for it was the sacred sacramental impulse, although I've also sometimes called it the aesthetic impulse, or kind of the attentive impulse. The reality is, when I put this together in a group of 6, the reason for that is that I have an instrument where you can kind of do a self-exploration, where you figure out what is my dominance in each of these. But in order to do that, it's 45 questions long. If you add one more category instead of 6, if you have 7, it goes from 45 to something like 85 or 90. And if you add another, it's well over 160. Because what you do is you have to choose between, just take my word for it. It was easier to combine and keep the instrument smaller than it was to make it something that nobody would want to do. So what we've got here is kind of a hodgepodge of several different but kind of closely related forms of spirituality. What makes all of them kind of similar is the shared attentiveness to God through some sort of external stimuli. So the first one we'll look at, I've got 2 heart's cries, so it's really 2 different, should have to come up with 2 different names for this. But the first one we'll look at is the heart's cry that says, I want to exercise my creative spirit together with your spirit, O God. Or related to that is the engagement with creativity of somebody else. Beauty drives me to God, and when I am surrounded by beauty or experience something beautiful, I'm with Him. So this version of this impulse has to do with creativity and beauty. And it's the reality that God is a creative and beautiful God. And when a person exercises creativity, for some folks, it is a way of being with him by being creative. I have a friend who was an artist. They were a painter, and they went through a particularly dark period of their life. They were in college, and they were doing a project, and he was painting this painting, and he had it up on an easel, and it wasn't going the way he wanted to. He's in this big courtyard in the center of a set of dorms, and he says he just attacked the painting. He kicked the painting off of the easel, and he kicked it around the courtyard, and he threw mud at it, and he hit it and slapped it, and then he put it back up on the easel, and he looked at it and he said, "Okay, now that's finished." Now, weird as that is, it gets weirder, because what he told me is that what actually he saw happen to himself was that when I said he was in a hard time, he was in a hard time with God. He was lonely and depressed and feeling broken and felt like God was very far away from him. And he felt like that God was a creative God, and when he did work with painting, usually the work was a kind of prayer for him. And he said that when this moment hit him, when he had this kind of temper tantrum with this painting and attacked it like that he was able to pour out all of that angst. And when he set the painting back up on the easel, he said it was like I set my life back up in order. And he said, I finally saw myself in the painting when it was damaged, when it was dirtied, when it was sullied. And yet as I stepped back from it, I saw that somehow it had become way more beautiful than if I had just painted it. And he said that for him was this unlocking of his relationship with God. That the fact that things were hard and difficult and lonely, he suddenly realized that God was kind of knocking him around. And then he was God's painting. Now, that sounds weird to me, because I don't do that. But I have enough stories of people who do that sort of thing to say God does this sort of thing. That God does interact in the creative process. And it's not always that violent. But very often, God will lift the person up as they create and interact with them while they're generating it. Weird, right? Okay, so the next one. This is the heart's cry that says, the story and the ritual of my faith build my spirit and they draw me to God. The truth is that God has established rituals and festivals and Sabbaths and rhythmic encounters to be experienced because God knows that the human heart is trained by regular interaction that is of a particular kind. The aesthetic heart that sees the beauty of the ritual is often very moved. There are people for whom the Lord's Supper is the big deal. Not just the big deal of the worship service, it's the big encounter with God. That when they come to the supper and they eat, they know they're taking the Christ into themselves. And it makes a difference in who they are. I know that for some of us, it can become rote. The word ritual can have a bad word to it. But, if you use a sociological term, the Lord's Supper is a ritual. And it is a ritual used by God to transform the human person. And the person who has the sacred approach to ritual, they know how to use it well. They interact with God while it's going on. And they may do the same with the entire worship service. Now, interestingly, the relational comes to the worship service because they know I can't sing this song by myself. I've got to have my other people with me, and that will empower me to come to God. And so they're coming to be with the people. The sacredist, though, they're going to come and be in that setting because that's where the song's going to be sung and the acts of worship are going to be carried out, and they know how to use all of those. And so they're paying close attention. The relationalist is paying close attention to the people and how God moves among them. And meanwhile, the sacredist is paying attention to the event and how God uses the event. Another heart's cry that might fit here is that I long to be I long to be with God in particular places and times. I find Him again and again in these particular places and times. So, some folks understand very well why it is in the Old Testament that when people would have an encounter with God, they would set up an altar, or they would set up a standing stone, and they would mark the place and say, "This place, here I met God." These folks, it's very common that they'll have a place in their room, in their house, where they will go pray. And they will always go there. When life gets hard, they know where to go. You might not know it. You might walk by and say that's a chair, but for them, it's more than a chair. It's the gates of heaven. I go there to sit in that place, and when my body goes and sits in that place, I draw close to God. If you look at the picture that's on the screen with this, you see that building? That's a Church of Christ in Monroe, Louisiana. And you see that sloping roof and all the wood and the beautiful, lovely floor. This is a place that's built aesthetically to project a certain atmosphere. I guarantee you that the architect who came up with that said, okay, if I put people in a particular atmosphere, they'll be able to pay attention to God more easily. I don't know if it's still there, but when I once went to Lincoln, Nebraska, there was a church there, again, Church of Christ. It's in the round, so that people sit all the way around the central location. The table was in the center, pulpit was in the center. So you're all the way, and it's I think about the 5/8 round. I think there was an opening at one side, probably for weddings. The whole place was in shades of blue. There were blue windows. It was all stained glass blue. The carpets were blue. The walls were painted blue. The seats were blue. And it's like they were blue on the lights. I mean, everywhere was quiet. You walked in and you just felt a sense of stillness and peace the moment you walk into the place. Now, I don't know that I'd want to worship there. That's kind of a little weird, but I guarantee you that the person that built that was saying, I can build a space where people will be quiet and still. And so this person was probably partly contemplative and partly an aesthetic, partly a sacredist. They were looking for sacred space. In the Churches of Christ, for the most part, we have not been about building sacred space. A lot of our churches look like warehouses, but that's starting to change. As you see, as you saw in that picture and you hear in my description, people are starting to say, no, there's something to the space in which we live. Finally, and this one is strangest of all, but I've met enough people to know that it's real. And that is the impulse that says, I see you everywhere. You are in the cloud, the deer, the paperclip, the grass growing through the sidewalk, the bubbles in my sink when I'm washing my dishes. I am always being surprised by your presence. This impulse is the person who, and I honestly think this is mostly an act of grace where God lifts a person into this. But I have met a few people who are kind of in this state, and I've known some people who are headed that direction. Where they really do see God in everything. I've met a person who told me about the one time they're walking down the path. They tend to talk like this, these people do. I was walking down the path and the deer walked out and stood right there, and they were just like 10 feet in front of me, man. And the deer looked at me and it wasn't afraid. And I looked at that deer and we just stood there, and it was like time stopped. And then it turned and it ran away. And it was like I was just with God, And I'm like, no, I don't know, but I wish I did. That's so cool. Or I met a person, I kid you not, who told me about contemplating a paper clip for like an hour and thinking about how God is traveling with them into their own heart and how their life makes turns that they don't expect. But God is working hard to get to the center. He wants the center of who they are. And they looked at that paperclip wondering, can I unbend my heart? Can I make it possible, easier for God to get in there? How can I? And a paperclip brought them to God. They were ignoring a lecture while they're staring at this paperclip and being moved closer to God. And that's weird. The soap bubble is also one that I've seen, that I've heard about, where seeing the rainbows in the soap bubble transfixed them, and they knew that they were that God was making promises to them, or they saw a whole bunch of birds fly away in the sky, and it was just like a sign. And I said to the person who told me that, a sign of what? And they said, oh, I don't know. It's just God's with me. He's with the bird, and He's with me. And I have been inclined in my life to kind of mock this. Until I started studying spirituality a little deeper and realized that these people were so far beyond me, it's not even funny. Because they were in the state of ceaseless prayer that I just aspire to. Especially this last group of people. Everything had become prayer to them. Prayer was everything, and everything was prayer. Because they were constantly attentive to God. And it didn't matter what it was, it could move them to think about God. That is a kind of holy, wondrous spirituality. I suspect it takes other work before you get there. You have to apply yourself to come here. But I also suspect that it's only if God lifts you do you ever reach this. The final impulse we'll look at this morning is that of experience, the experiential spiritual impulse. And this person says, the heart's cry is, where do I see, feel, and experience the power of God working in my life and in the lives of those around me as He overcomes the brokenness of this world? In a way, this sounds an awful lot like the activist, but the difference is, in the activist, the person wants to be the agent. And in the experientialist, the person is witness or observer. They see the movement of God. This is the person who will come to you and say, I've got a story to tell. I need to tell you about this. This is what God has done in my life. And sometimes those stories are mundane. I met with a friend, and we had a conversation, and God really unlocked this for me, and God was there with us in that conversation. And so the story is really about how God used the conversation. Or maybe it's dramatic. I was driving, my tire blew out, I was on ice, I went into a spin, and I was headed right into oncoming traffic, and then the car's spin reversed itself and went off into a ditch. I don't even know how that's possible, but that's what happened. I was going this way, and then suddenly, I don't know if I hit something or an angel pushed me or what, but suddenly I'm spinning that way, and I went from going that direction towards that semi to that direction towards that ditch, and I'm fine, and I should have died. And that's what God has done for me. And because He did that, I'm more committed to Him. The experientialist is drawn close to God as they interpret the events of their life or anticipate the future and how God might act. A radical experientialist is going to be engaged in radical prayer. All of these folks pray somehow, but these folks pray with a kind of specificity. God, please do this. And He does. It is amazing how often experientialist prayers are specific and specifically answered. The power encounter is a missionary term for what missionaries do on the mission field. I'll say mission one more time. But I heard a story about a missionary who's on the mission field, and he's with the chief of this village. He's been wanting this chief to come and be a part of Christianity. And the chief said, why would I want your gods? I have my gods. And my gods always deliver. Your gods, I don't know, but my gods always deliver. Every year at his festival, He's provided us with clear skies. It's never rained on this day, and He will provide it. And the missionary said, really? Well, it's going to rain this year. And the guy laughed at him. And then the day of the festival came, and the missionary came. It's clear blue skies. And the chief saying, yeah, where's your God? My God's here giving me blue skies. And the guy says, hey, festival's not over yet, is it? And while they're talking, a cloud begins to form off on the horizon, and it builds up, and a huge thunderstorm comes, and it's a deluge, and it's like 5 inches of rain in 2 minutes. And then it goes away in clear blue skies, and the chief becomes a Christian. That's a power encounter. And that's an experientialist experience. And I've got stories like this. The experientialist is all about telling the stories. I had a friend in seminary who they'd paid everything, but they had food, but they had a bill come, and it was $16.42, and they had to pay that, but they had no money. And they didn't want to go late because it would affect their credit, and it was it was a rough time, and they came to a prayer group and they said, "Will you pray for us, please? We need $16.42." And so the group prayed. The next day, the missionary's wife, missionary in training, goes to the mailbox and pulls out an envelope, and it's from somewhere in Minnesota. Neither of them have ever been to Minnesota. But they have a cousin who has an aunt, who has a sister, who has a brother, who has a nephew, who has a relative at this church in Minnesota. And it's a church of 8 people. Inside the envelope is a letter from them. It says, "Hey, you don't know us, but we heard about you through this long strain of relationships. We know that you're training to do mission service. And we are 8 people, and we often feel very sorry for ourselves. And one of us said during our worship the other day, we haven't done anything to help anybody but us in forever. And I think God wants us to help a missionary. Does anybody know of anybody?" And one of us finally raised their hand and said, "You." So what we did is we took out the money out of our pockets, and we put it all in the collection plate, and our treasurer has written a check. We're sorry it can't be more, but we're a tiny church. Here it is. And guess what? $16.42. Okay, or 48, whatever. It was exactly what they needed. Not partly what they needed, precisely to the penny. That's the experientialist. They will tell you those stories. The missionaries tell you tons of these stories because they have these experiences on the front line. So that's the impulses. And like I said at the very beginning, here are the impulses again, or the modes again. And people will tend to look at one of those and say, that's heretical. But I can show you Jesus acting in every single one of these impulses. Let's do that quickly, and then we'll probably be out of time. First, is Jesus the activist? And you see Jesus in the temple flipping over tables. Now, why is he doing that? Why does he take a whip and drive out the money changers? Why does he do that? Well, because the temple is supposed to be a place for prayer. And this is all set up in the court of the Gentiles. Meaning, well, they're just Gentiles. Who cares if there's a bunch of cows lowing and they can't pray to our God? And this is supposed to be a house of prayer, but they've made it a den of thieves. It's oppressing people who the society says they don't really matter. Jesus says they do matter. And so as the activist, he interacts with his God and he says no, and he flips the tables. Jesus, the contemplative, is the one who withdraws into the wilderness to pray. He goes to be still and quiet. People demand his time, but Jesus guards his time. And you see him stopping to interact with God and to be quiet. And the people come and say, "What are you doing here? You're needed." And he says, "I gotta pray. But let's go to the next village. They need that also." And so he's in and out of the contemplative experience. Jesus, as the doctrinalist, is Jesus the teacher. He goes to synagogue and teaches. He stands on the mountainside and he teaches. And Jesus is such a teacher that no one could question whether he was a doctrinalist. And so much of what he does is interpretive of what God has already done. He interprets the law of Moses in a new and different way. Jesus is very much a doctrinalist, and he knows the scriptures. Jesus, as the relationalist, is Jesus among the disciples, Jesus who makes friends with Mary and Martha. You know, he goes to these places, and God is with him in the gathering. And of course, he is a relationalist in that wherever he's present, he brings God to those people. And then Jesus, as the aesthetic, you see him teaching in the temples. He clearly valued the temple. He didn't want it becoming an idol. When people said, "Look at these beautiful stones," he'd say, "Well, it's going to be torn down." But he could also say, "Look, I was teaching here every day." He valued that space. He knew that people who come to this place are better prepared to listen. And so he would use the aesthetic. Jesus is also, I don't have a slide for this, but Jesus is also the one who establishes rituals. He's the one who establishes baptism. He's the one who establishes the Lord's Supper so that our hearts can be guided through those experiences and interact with it. And that's very much the sacredist impulse. And then Jesus as the experientialist is Jesus who you see doing the healings and encountering demons. Jesus has wondrous stories to tell. And so you see him in all of these impulses, in all of them. And of course, that's Jesus kind of affirming these things. Don't manufacture artificial realities, and don't use them to your detriment where you ignore God by doing them. But Jesus would affirm, do all of these. You can be with God in all of them. So, as kind of a final closing word, really for not just this lecture, but for the whole class, let me suggest that God works in His people when they draw near to Him. When our hearts are open and we are attentive to Him, He empowers us to walk by His Spirit and not by our flesh, so that our efforts to be good people are not just our own efforts, but our combined efforts together with God as He transforms us from the inside out. So may you walk with the Spirit of God, and may we all join together and walk with His Spirit as He works among us.